Hey, it's Friday, so welcome back to Fundraisers Friday on the Nonprofit Show. Welcome, Tony Bell.
Hey there, Julia. Happy Friday. I hope everyone's had a great week and ready for a relaxing and recharged weekend.
I love that you said that, relaxing and recharged. We need that, don't we?
hmm We
We
talk
really,
often about the balance. And so
yeah,
you
we
have
do.
to, invest in yourself and give yourself that time.
Yeah, you do. Well, especially with this topic, because we're going to be talking about data informed goal setting and what that means. And so many of us are kind of working at that pace right now where we are looking at our goals, the year that we're in, planning for next year. If you're dealing with a fiscal year, I mean, there's a lot going on at this moment in time. And I think it causes a lot of stress, don't you,
Mhm.
Tony?
Yes, of course. Well, just determining goals, fulfilling goals.
Yeah.
Anytime you talk about goals, it definitely adds a little stress to your day.
Yeah, it really, really does. Well, let's get into it. We have amazing goals that we set with our presenting sponsors, and they include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Interim Executives Academy, Your Part-Time Controller, and of course, Tony and myself at
Mhm.
Fundraisers Friday. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy, joined by one of the legends of the nonprofit sector, Tony Bell, Mr. Nonprofit Consultancy. And boy, are we glad that we have him because this is a barn burner of a show talking about something that gives folks a lot of stress. Tony, I'm going to throw it out there. I think there's a lot of mystery involved in these goals and goal setting. And so, one of the things, and I mentioned this in the green room, when I first met you 5, 6 years ago, you really gave me that lens of the magic 3 years of past performance. What does that mean?
Well, what that means is, when we talk about past fundraising performance, there are so many different areas that we can take a look at and analyze the data from. I use 3 years just based on my own experience because I
Okay.
feel like if you go farther than 3 years, that data is a little irrelevant. That 3 years keeps it a little bit closer to now, so that the information and the trends that you're looking at are a little more realistic in terms of what the landscape might look like today. But again, when we're talking about goals, and I loved how the marketing materials for today's show look like. It's like just don't pick a number. That we're not all sitting at a desk waiting to yell bingo because we got all the right numbers, right? So so it has to be based on past performance, really data driven. And when it's data driven, when it's based on truth and transparency, historic performance, uh, assumptions about future performance, it removes a lot of the mystery. I think it also removes a lot of the stress
Hmm.
when the decisions that are being made based on data and truth. So there
Okay,
are many
so
different lanes for that, Julie, and I share with you in the green room, as I often do before our shows. I did some research, made some notes for those that are watching the show, forgive me if my eyes leave the camera for a minute just to, reflect my notes to make sure I'm staying on top
yeah.
of the topic. But thinking about, individual donor performance, event performance, all of the different verticals or lanes in which your organization is raising money, what has that looked like historically? And what has that percentage of the overall fundraising look like for each of those individual lanes? So really starting with that kind of data, and taking a look at that.
So do you think that's actually even more important than doing just like this overall giant number and it's like it's yay or nay, we did it or we didn't, or I mean, do you see what I'm saying? I mean, because if we drill down, sometimes that can help us, but sometimes it can kind of like muddy the water. What do you think?
Yeah, no, no. Well, I guess it depends on kind of the organization norms and just the
Okay.
mentality of the organization.
Okay.
So yes, some organizations will say we need to raise $2 million,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
$2 million. And then they try and figure out how that's going. So then they'll work backwards from that.
Okay.
Organizations are more successful than when they look at their reality and these different lanes again in which they're raising money and saying, okay, within major gifts, and when you look at your budget, and I'm going to get ahead of myself in some of the conversation because I know as we move along, we'll touch on some of this. But really kind of saying, okay, so with major gifts, and major gifts are usually the larger percentage when you kind of look at some type of capacity analysis for your organization. Your major gifts, you're hoping are going to make up 40 to 50% of your annual budget. So really kind of starting there and looking, okay, so major gifts, what is that going to look like for us in the next budget year? Looking at events. All right, we usually do 2 events. Do we need to do 3? What is that going to look like? And what are events? What is that contribution going to be to the overall fundraising for that budget year? So again, kind of looking at each of those lanes, what is the realistic percentage of increase that we can expect? And then that is what ultimately tells us where we think we can land. Now, if there's a gap, let's say that we do that. And let's say that tells us we can raise 1.5 million. But other things that need to take place within the organization really demand that there be 2 million. Well, now we know that we have this $500,000 gap, and what are we going to do about it?
Right. Let me throw a curveball to you. You can get up your catcher's mitt. We have moved through the pandemic, and I feel like so many organizations had to completely reset their budgets because of different funding sources, because of all this turmoil that we went through. Do we just keep to this past 3 years, or should we factor in some pre-pandemic things? I mean, we're talking now a 5-year difference, but what's your sense of that? Should we just be like, that was in the past, now we're moving forward? Like, how do we mitigate some of that information?
That's a really great question, Julia. And I, as I think about it, I could probably go in a bunch of different directions. I think if you ask that question to most people, they're going to say that time period is over. That time period doesn't matter anymore. We have other challenges in front of us.
Yes.
And other opportunities and hurdles to overcome. So I think most people would say whatever happened 5 years ago happened 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And if you're still kind of operating in that 5 year ago mode, you're probably not poised for the best level of success.
I love that comment. I think you're right. Slough off that past. Think about what's going on now. I mean, just think about 5 years ago, the avenues that we have to fundraise and the channels didn't exist, a lot of them, and the technology, right? So
they didn't exist. And I think, and this is my opinion. I don't have data to support this, but my opinion would be that those folks that had leaned into technology and had more ways to engage with folks through apps or through online opportunities were probably some of the ones that might have managed through that a little bit better than others in terms of new engagement and great opportunities for stewardship through some of the digital platforms.
Right. I think that's a great comment. Well, let's talk about the channels that we need to be thinking about and really maybe dig in a little bit more than that, because I think this is one of the things you touched on or started to touch on, was that we do have different channels. It's not all just the same thing. How should we be looking at this? Should we give specific percentages to events versus major gifts versus grants, or just kind of, freewheel it a little bit? Like, how specific should we be when it comes to the data that we have to really pursue and ingest?
Yeah. So I think the data answers that question, Julia. So depending on, again, being mindful of just the plethora, I've been dying to use that word, for the plethora of organizations that lead into the nonprofit show and the great professional development that you provide. They're all shapes and sizes, and their budgets and how they raise money look very differently. So really, what does your organization look like? I've shared many times that my fundraising career, I worked with a lot of organizations that were event heavy. And so I would have 11 events in a
Oh,
calendar year. Uh, so of course, that organization is going to look at events and how are we going to amp up the percentage of funds raised from each of those events? Which ones do we need to kind of take off, off of our plate because they're not really giving us the return on investment that we're looking for? Uh, so really, depending on the organization, look at those revenue streams, and then just determine based on capacity, based on again just historical trends, what does the percentage of increase look like for each of those? And again, for higher ed, major gifts is probably the larger. For smaller organizations, it might be the monthly social that they do and the two big fundraisers that they do every month, mixed in with some peer-to-peer fundraising and maybe a few folks that continue to give on a monthly basis.
right. Do you have a sense that when we're looking at these channels, that there is a logical percentage increase? Like, I think a lot of times people are like, oh, well, we need to, double our goal, or versus like, okay, no, we need to look at a 5% increase or 7%. Like, what what should that logical number, which still could be a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think a lot of times if we hear, oh, we want a 5%, rate of growth, um, that might
Yeah.
not be the
So
goal.
so I think I want to share this one thing, and again I'm going to apologize because I want to read this specifically that I had written down. And so when we're thinking about this and goal setting and what that annual number might need to look like, instead of kind of starting with that, kind of thinking about when I need to explain to the board of directors or senior leadership or my team, when I need to communicate that fundraising goal, we would want to say something like, based on our current donor pipeline, projected renewal rate, and new major gift prospects, we believe we can reasonably raise X number of dollars. So
Yeah.
maybe if you start your process with that kind of statement and leave the dollar figure empty, that just thinking about projected renewal rate, donor
Mhm.
pipeline, major gift prospects. And when we talk about gift prospects, when we talk about the pipeline, we have to keep in mind that it usually takes 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 prospects to get the actual commitment and donation from an individual. Uh,
Mhm.
so again, just kind of starting with that, and then saying things like, and in order to get there, we're going to need to reactivate lapsed donors. We're going to need to deepen relationships with mid-level donors. So many just great strategies and great opportunities, I think, when you look at all of the diverse revenue streams for your organization, but maybe starting with that why statement, uh,
Yeah.
the why and the how.
I love that because I think it goes beyond the number, and it also sets up a roadmap. I think a lot of times, we invest so much on what the number is and the goal. We don't invest on how we get to the goal, right? And
So
so
important.
then it's a total, beat down because we're just like, we didn't get anywhere near that goal, or you don't understand how you're going to march towards it. And then you have to, I think a lot of organizations start out every year almost recrafting an entire strategy on how to meet the goal
Well,
versus
and
really
I'm
fundamental.
And not only that, I'm glad that you brought that up, Julia, because a lot of organizations will start their annual budget from zero, as if there's no
Yeah.
money in the bank. So, there are,
Yeah.
so there's that kind of philosophy also that we experience with some nonprofit boards and senior leadership. So I hope that answered the question and
Yeah.
gave folks some food for thought around that particular topic.
Yeah. I mean, it's really an interesting, it's a bigger picture than just one answer, right? A goal has so many layers to it. And I feel like a lot of folks in the nonprofit sector, and I'm going to call it out for boards too, there's like a number. It's like you said, we've got to raise 2 million bucks. Okay, you're a winner if you meet it or beat it, and you're a total loser, get on to the next job if you're under it, versus the strategy and understanding the different parts, because it's not one thing, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And and I encourage folks that I mentioned this a lot lately. I'm going to continue to. But as you dig deeper into this topic and you look at kind of ways that you can do a capacity analysis for your organization, lean into AI. There are so many solutions there to help you kind of navigate what that looks like, templates that can be provided and downloaded. So, ask those questions to AI to help you kind of dive a little bit deeper.
So we talked about this in the green room briefly. Can you segue off a little bit and really give us a better definition of what we're talking about when we bandy about the term capacity building?
Oh, yeah, well, sure. Well, capacity building just means having the resources to do the work, having the resources, the tools, the technology to meet the goal. And so often when we are looking at our budgets, there are going to be times where, our where we have to have that conversation. I think I'm jumping a little bit ahead in our slides, Julia, where the budget conversation has to align with organizational needs. And sometimes that organizational need is not to enhance or grow a program, but to build capacity first so that you can, in the future, effectively grow and enhance some programs and services. So that capacity building might be staff, it might be technology, and that's a whole different kind of fundraising strategy than when you're fundraising specifically for your programs where you have these outcomes that demonstrate,
Yeah.
45 people, receive meals in this week. So it's a whole different kind of strategy and messaging. Critical, super important. The work can't be done without it.
Right.
There's a reason why we hear the term overhead myth.
Mhm.
Like any good successful business, there needs to be talent and people to drive the mission and deliver on the promise.
Right. I love that you uh, took that thread and kind of wove it through the conversation, because I don't think we spend enough time on it. Um, and time is flying by. I want to move into predictive metrics and that anticipation of what the revenue is, things that you generate, things that come in. Again, I feel like maybe this is so hard to even wrap your head around unless you apply a specific percent of growth to each one of the channels. I mean, what are your thoughts here on this?
Well, I think you have to look at retention rates also when you talk about predictive metrics. You can't predict based on history without also thinking about retention and what
Okay.
retention rates look like for your organization. Well, this is just a perfect example of why so many organizations have successfully implemented recurring giving programs within their organization so that they know every month based on their current subscribers that they're going to have X number of dollars coming into the organization to support their mission. So what does that what does that look like for the future? What are your retention rates with those recurring donors? So retention rates play a big part in how you predict some of your anticipated revenue.
Yeah.
Again, whether that be major gifts, mid-level gifts, smaller gifts, or even through events. If you're event historically does really well because you have 500 people attend, have you always been able to have 500 people? And if
Yeah,
not, then how do you make sure that that happens? So, you know,
right,
that data and retention rates are really important as you look at that particular topic.
right. Tony, it goes back to like, you know, that old adage, garbage in, garbage out. It's just so critical to have good information and be tracking things so that you can make these decisions. And I I kind of believe that for some organizations, this is going to be the stretch, that they don't even have good data with which to make these decisions. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, we've talked about we've talked about this before in some episodes, and it is a recurring theme, just how important it is for organizations to invest in the technology or the manpower, again, however you're structured, whatever you're comfortable with, to really, one, ensure the integrity of the data, and then second, be able to easily point to where the data comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I've worked in an organization with a major donor who did their own audit annually. And so being able to point to very specifically where the data came from, the data sources, the integrity of the data, really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this goal alignment. And you made a comment that in the early time where if you analyze all this data and you're like, okay, we feel really confident we can pull in 1.5 million, but then the finance department or C-suite or board, whoever, or all three, they're like, no, we can't operate if we don't have 2.2 million. How often does that happen?
Hmm, that's a good question about how often it happens. I think a lot of times that happens based on the ambition of the board.
Okay.
And I say ambition versus ego,
Okay, good.
because I think that a lot of time, because most boards, the majority of boards, their ambition to serve is to better the community. Their ambition in wanting to raise 2.5 versus 1.5 is motivated by a desire to further serve, to expand services, to grow the organization. And I often say there's nothing wrong with being exceptional at one thing versus
Mm-hmm.
being mediocre at quite a few. So that's just to say that when we say 1.5 will keep us exceptional, 2.5 will help us expand, but then we might be mediocre.
Wow.
So staying just exceptional at one thing versus stretching yourself to be mediocre at many things is not necessarily a good move.
You know, to me, that's a real cultural thing because in this country, bigger is better.
Hmm.
You got to have the bigger car, you got to lease more space, you got to have a bigger house, you got to have bigger, in my world, bigger hair, right? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
I too.
So it's really an interesting, I don't know, an interesting value because I think to your point, a lot of board members, especially if they're coming from the for-profit world, where it's all about growth, growth, growth. And but pulling back a little bit on the reins and saying, okay, where are we going to really be exceptional? I like that. I don't think I've ever been a part of a board discussion that had that. It's always been about growth, grow, grow, grow. But I really like that framework.
And well, thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, this is also where the conversation takes place around capacity building and infrastructure needs. And
Mm-hmm.
so when we talk about fundraising, again, so much of what the conversation kind of centers around is the forward-facing services and programs. But there may be a lot, within our infrastructure and within the organization that we need to invest in order to be the best we can be to grow, the forward-facing programs and
Right.
services.
Right. It's really an interesting aspect of of setting up your goals. I think a lot of times we just think, oh, we just need to pick that one number. But what I really learned from you today, it's so multifaceted. We really got to look at these different channels, and we need to understand how all the little parts come together to make a whole. And
Sure.
really, really interesting. I want to end with this, and we both touched on this a little bit throughout, but understanding the documentation of the data sets and where the metrics come from. How important do you think this is? Do you think that every single thing that we present needs to be, you know, explained of where we came up with this? The reason why I ask this question is that I feel like for the majority of our nation's history, our philanthropy has been emotionally based. This is a new dawn. Now we are working with data metrics and data sets. And this is a challenge because a lot of us in our sector, we have not been good at tracking this information.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, what are
Hmm.
your thoughts on this as we wrap up today on Fundraisers Friday?
Well, yeah, no, it's really important that we determine what those data sets and metrics need to look like, and sometimes those are donor driven. So again, depending on your
Mhm.
organization, a lot of times the metrics and what that looks like, what your dashboards look like, what your reporting structure looks like, may be driven by some of your donors. Uh,
Mhm.
I believe, though, that as philanthropy has evolved from more than a pull at the heartstrings,
Yeah.
but in terms of a true partnership with your donor, folks want to understand what are the outcomes of my
Yeah.
investment in most cases. And again, it depends on the investment and what the investment is intended for and all of that.
Yeah.
But being able to go back to a donor and say, your investment did X, Y, and Z, and
Mhm.
this is how I know that.
Mhm.
Because I can look back on this data set, these surveys, whatever that looks like,
Yeah.
and report back to you on the level of engagement and just the positive effect that our programs and services have had. It's really important. So again, whether you're investing in technology or in human resources to compile this information and ensure the integrity of this data, uh, it is up to you. But the most important thing is that it happens.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. And I love that you said that. This is a really powerful way to end, is that when you're communicating with stakeholders, donors, partners, this is important. And I know this to be so because of this data. I think that's brilliant. I think that's a way that we need to be communicating to our donors as opposed to the emotional side. I think we need to quote unquote tell the story, but I think we need to shift to more data storytelling,
And
right?
absolutely. Absolutely. And don't be afraid to say things like, we have 300 other donors that are committed to the
Yeah,
outcomes of this program. And so, again, data. Oh, I'm not the only, there are 300 other people that have
right.
invested in this. Well, I want to be a part of that.
I
So,
love that.
you know,
Yeah, that's super cool. That's really cool. What a great way to end. This has been a great conversation. And if you have questions for us, send them our way. You can reach us on all of our socials. You can direct email us at info at American Nonprofit Academy. Everybody from our executive producer, Kevin Pace, to Tony and myself, we're out there, and we want to know what questions you might have. So let us know. We do once a month or so, we take a lot of the questions that come in and we just put them in one ask and answer episode, and that's really fun because it gives us the opportunity to respond to a lot of different things that come our way. And so definitely let us know what you're thinking. We think every day about how privileged we are to have the support of our presenting sponsors. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Interim Executives Academy, Your Part-Time Controller, and of course us at Fundraisers Friday. What a great opportunity we have here to share this amazing knowledge. Tony Bell, what a gem you are. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
The highlight of my week. I say it all the time. No, thank you, Julia. It's such an honor to share my experience and hopefully help empower and elevate those in the field. And just so grateful for all the work they do.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I know you and I have said this off camera, but the fundraisers are the ones that make our community strong and vibrant. And whether we know it or not, they impact the lifestyle of everyone in the community. They really do. And so it's a powerful thing. Hey, as we welcome the weekend and the episode, we want to remind everyone to stay well so you can do well. We'll see you again.